Welcome! This is part 4, the 4th video in our 5-part video series that tells the fantastic story of how the United States ended up acquiring all of its vast territory that now comprises the continental United States. So in videos 1 through 3, we saw how these various European empires crossed the Atlantic Ocean and came to own and occupy and colonize what is today the United States. Now, we left off on our story at the end of part 3 at the close of the American Revolutionary War. So the American colonists had just won their independence from Britain, and we saw the territory that was owned by the United States when it was created. And this territory is reflected in blue on this map. So now we are down to 2 countries here. So the territory to the east, reflected in blue, is the territory that is owned by the brand spanking new nation of the United States. And the rest of the territory to the west and Florida is the territory that was owned by Spain. So what happened next? Well, let's jump right into part 4. The United States now exists. So the United States has been founded, it now exists, and its territory is defined. And so this seems like a pretty, secure arrangement here. You've got the United States with its territory, you got Spain with its territory, and both parties have agreed on the boundary line. So this seems like it is going to be the permanent situation that, will last off into the future forever. But as we know, when the United States was founded, this territory is only a small portion of what the United States would end up owning across the continental United States. So how did the United States acquire more territory? And it started with New Orleans. So this is the city of New Orleans that is located down in the Gulf Coast. So the city of New Orleans is an incredibly important city for its strategic location because it is located right along the Mississippi River, the mouth of the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River is critically important to the United States because it runs almost all the way up to Canada. It is a really wide river, so it provides access all the way to the interior of the United States. And now the Mississippi runs all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, so the ocean, and it's an ocean port. So from that ocean port, you're then able to access trade by sea to all sorts of other locations around the United States, but also around the world. So through this port, all the products from the United States can come down to the Mississippi and then go out to the world, and all the products that are imported from the world can go from the world by ocean to the New Orleans and then make it interior, all the way interior to the United States. In fact, President Thomas Jefferson once said that almost half of the nation's products pass through New Orleans to get to market. That is huge. So this city of New Orleans, this port city of New Orleans, is incredibly important. So New Orleans is owned by Spain now. So New Orleans previously was founded by the French, because remember, the French owned all this territory in the middle of the United States, all the way down to New Orleans. So the French founded the city of New Orleans, but when the French got kicked out of the United States by Britain in the 7 Years' War, what happened to the French territory? It got split in half between Britain and Spain, and it was right along the Mississippi River. So all the territory to the east of the Mississippi went to Britain, which has now become the United States, and all the territory to the west of the Mississippi went to Spain. So this territory that went to Spain became known as the Louisiana Territory. So Spain now owns the Louisiana Territory, and part of that territory that went to Spain included New Orleans. So Spain now owns New Orleans. So you got the United States and Spain here divided along the Mississippi River. So they're trying to work together with each other on how to share the Mississippi River and trade routes and all that. And that included how products are going to come in and out of the port down at the Gulf Coast, which included New Orleans. So they were trying to share it and enter into an agreement and all this stuff. And it was going okay, but it was also, it was just giving rise to a number of conflicts. So even at one point, the Spanish even revoked a treaty, and they threatened that they would exclude the United States from the port of New Orleans entirely. So, the Spanish backed away from that, but nonetheless, the United States was having a hard time here, and they realized that they really need to do something about this in New Orleans, because they could not be contingent upon some foreign power controlling this significant port that so tremendously affected the United States. So they had to do something about this. Meanwhile, events are underway in Europe, and that was that this guy Napoleon Bonaparte has come to power in France in 1799. So Napoleon takes over, and he is an aggressive guy here. And so he goes to Spain, and he says to Spain, hey, Spain, all this territory that you got west of the Mississippi that you got from France when France got kicked out of the United States? Well, I want it back. So he basically forces Spain to give him this territory back. So this whole territory that went to Spain west of the Mississippi goes back to France. And this is in 1800 by a treaty, but it was in secret. Okay, so nobody knew about it. The United States didn't know about it. So eventually, people start to figure out, wait a minute, it doesn't seem like Spain's really in control here. And then they figure out that actually now, France owns it, and now France is controlled by Napoleon. And all of a sudden, the United States becomes alarmed that France now owns this territory, right? Because, the reason is that France, it seems, is now trying to reestablish the French Empire back in the United States. This is a huge problem for the United States. So then, in 1801, Napoleon sends armed troops into New Orleans to secure New Orleans for France. Okay, so this sounds another alarm bell for the United States, right? Because it's bringing ever closer the possibility that Napoleon is going to want to extend the French Empire into the United States. So by this time, the president of the United States is Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson, this is the guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence back in 1776, a founding father of the United States, and the third president of the United States. So the first president was George Washington, then John Adams, and then Thomas Jefferson now. So he's the president, the third president of the United States. And he says, look, I've got to do something about this. Now, it's a little bit tricky because France is supposed to be an ally. It is an ally of the United States. Remember, France is the one who came over and helped the United States acquire its independence from Britain. So the United States is supposed to be friends with France, but at the same time, the United States is thinking, I want to be friends with France, but I also cannot have France coming in here and establishing a new empire in the United States. So it's a little bit tricky. So what Thomas Jefferson says is, you know what? Maybe we can buy the city of New Orleans from France. So if we could do that, that would be, a good solution. So Thomas Jefferson sends a couple of emissaries over to France to negotiate the purchase of the city of New Orleans from France. And he authorizes these guys, you guys can spend up to $10 million to buy New Orleans. So off these guys go to France. They show up at the meeting to negotiate the purchase with the French guys. So the French guys come in the room, and the French guys say, you know what, we will sell it to you. And what we'll sell to you is the Louisiana Territory. So the American guys are thinking to themselves, wait a minute, the Louisiana Territory, we were only here to buy just the city of New Orleans. But these guys are offering to sell the entire Louisiana Territory. So they're thinking to themselves, well, that would be great if we could get it, but, we probably can't afford it. So they ask the French, well, how much would you want to charge for that? And the French say, $15 million. So the Americans think to themselves, what? So that for only $5 million more. Remember, they were authorized to spend $10 million for just the city of New Orleans, and the French are now, for only $5 million more, offering the entire Louisiana Territory for only $5 million more. So the Americans are like, we've got to take this deal. We cannot let this pass. So they take the deal. Both sides want to sign up the deal as fast as possible. So they end up signing the treaty in like 3 weeks. So the United States has just purchased the Louisiana Territory. The purchase was in 1803. It became known as the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Territory was huge, so it's represented here in green, and this is superimposed on a contemporary map of the United States. So none of these states existed yet, and this territory was all owned by Spain. Florida was still owned by Spain, so the United States only owned this territory, so you can see acquiring this territory was quite significant, and all for just $15 million. Now, the United States was prepared to pay $10 million for just the city of New Orleans, so for only $5 million more, they acquired all this territory. It amounted to like 3 cents an acre. And I mean, this territory is so huge. It comprises today of what are now all are a portion of 15 states. You know, some of them are, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Minnesota, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana. Is just huge. Bounded here by the Mississippi River to the east and over to the west, all the way over to the Rocky Mountains. So, and in fact, it doubled the size of the United States territory. So before the purchase, this was the United States. After the purchase, after including this, it doubled the size of the United States. In fact, this was viewed by many as the greatest single achievement of the entire presidency of Thomas Jefferson. Now, why did Napoleon sell it? Why didn't he keep the Louisiana Territory? Why did he sell it, and why did he sell it for so cheap? This is a great question, and in fact, if you're a teacher, this is a great question to put to your students and really make them sit with it for a while. Make them think about it, make them guess, because the answer is sort of obvious, but you really have to think through it. So this is a good thing to let them spend some time with and try to figure it out. So the main reason as to why he sold it is because he was going to lose it anyway. And Napoleon kind of figured this out. He figured out the sort of the writing on the wall. He couldn't defend it, right? He wasn't going to send all these troops over there to defend this territory, and he didn't have the population there of French people to occupy it, and he wasn't going to try to send a whole bunch of people over there in a short period of time. He knew he couldn't defend it. So he saw that he was going to lose it anyway, and he thought that the United States would likely go to war over it, and he was probably right. Certainly, Jefferson probably would have gone to war over New Orleans, right, to protect New Orleans for the United States, and Jefferson probably would have gone to war over control of the Mississippi River. So he was probably right in that respect. So that might make sense. You might be thinking, okay, well, now I see why he sold it and let it go, but why did he sell it for so cheap? And it kind of ties into his overall strategy. So what Napoleon had going on at the time, right, so this is 1803, he was in the process of building out his empire. So he was building an empire in Europe. He needed soldiers to build out his empire in Europe, and he realized that in the United States, taking territory would be to spread himself too thinly, and this territory, he couldn't defend it anyway. It would cost him way too much money to try to send a part of his military and people over here. He needed his military and people in the empire that he was trying to build out. And at the time, Napoleon was actually planning an invasion of Britain. He was going to invade Britain and take over the entire British Empire. All right, now this never happened, but nonetheless, that's what he was planning on doing. So what did he need? He needed money, and he needed money fast. He didn't need huge piles of money. He just needed enough money to build out his army so he could take over the British Empire. Then once he invaded Britain and took over the British Empire, he didn't need any more money then. Then he'd have all the money that he needed in the world, right? So if he were bogged down in trying to get as much money he could out of the United States for the Louisiana Purchase, this would lead to a long, protracted negotiation. Instead, what he wanted was money quickly up front, enough money to build out his army to invade Britain. That's why he sold it quickly and cheaply. So it kind of makes sense. It all kind of comes together there, which is pretty interesting. So now the United States acquired all of this territory. So the question that they were facing then is, what do we do with it? What do we do with all this territory? And Jefferson, the first thing Jefferson did with it is he said, you know what? Let's understand what we have. Let's understand what's there, which is a pretty good thought. So he sends out these expeditions out into the Louisiana Territory to figure out what's there. And the most famous expedition was the expedition of Lewis and Clark. So that's what that was all about, 1804 to 1806. So Lewis and Clark, these two guys, they go out and explore this territory to figure out what's there. Interestingly, one of their objectives was to find a waterway passage through all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, this sounds familiar to us, right? Because this was the same reason why Columbus set sail in 1492 from Spain. He was looking for a passageway to China over the sea. And we've seen for centuries, all these explorers are looking to try to cut through North America with a waterway to get to the Pacific Ocean. And now here we are, 300 years later under Jefferson in 1803, he's looking for the same thing, a waterway passage to the Pacific Ocean. Pretty funny. Now, we know now that he never found it, because we know now that there is no passageway, a waterway to the Pacific Ocean in the United States. So, but the expedition of Lewis and Clark is a fascinating expedition, and in fact, this is an area for further study. It's a great story, and there's a lot to it, and it's wonderful. In fact, the filmmaker Ken Burns made a wonderful film about it, and I would highly recommend looking at that film, because it's really terrific. It shows all the magic and wonderment of the expedition. So they're exploring the territory to figure out what's there, which is great. But the question is also, how do we take all this new territory and bring it into the framework of the United States? And it sounds like that might be a good problem to have. We acquired all this new territory, but in fact, it also led to some problems. And one of the biggest problem was over the question of slavery. Now, the question was, all right, so this Louisiana Territory is gonna turn into a number of new states, and then those new states will be brought into the United States. So are those new states, are they going to be slave states that permit slavery, or are they going to be states where slavery is banned? Now, this was a huge question, and you might wonder, well, why was that such a big deal? And it was a big deal because it had to do with what was going on in the existing Congress of the United States. So in the existing Congress, there was a division between northern states and southern states. And southern states permitted slavery, and northern states did not have slaves. And the reason was it had to do with the economy. So again, it all goes back to money. It's all about money. So in the South, the economy of the South was based upon plantations and growing crops. And this industry required, great labor. So there were, tremendous labor requirements, and up until now, they had been using slave labor to accomplish this on the plantations. So it was a critical component of their economy. That's what they believed. I mean, slavery had been going on there for over 100 years. This was part of their economy. So just eliminating slavery would destroy their economy, is what they felt. So it wasn't just a moral question. It was very hard for these people to say, okay, I'm going to eliminate slavery when it would ruin their livelihoods, right, is what they thought. On the North, in the other hand, the North, they were not dependent upon plantations, and thus they were not dependent upon slavery. Their economy was based on manufacturing and the increasing industrialization and banking and that sort of thing. So they were against slavery. It was relatively easier for them to be against slavery on the moral grounds. Slavery is wrong. We shouldn't do this, because it didn't ruin their economy. So this is the division that you had in the United States between the southern slave owners and the northern states that were really struggling with each other. So now you might say, well, okay, but so why does the Louisiana Territory affect that? Because the slave-owning states have their slaves and the North don't have their slaves. So why do they care so much what happened with the new Louisiana Territory, whether there's slavery there or not? And the reason is it had to do with power. It had to do with power in Congress and the power to direct the entire nation, the direction of the entire nation. So, because if you think about it, let's say all these new states would become anti-slave states. So slaves were not permitted in these new states. Now what would happen? All these new states from the Louisiana Purchase would now come into the Union, and they would align with the northern states. And now the northern states would have way more power as a nation. So what the nation could do then is they could create policy. They could even potentially outlaw slavery for the whole nation, including the South. Or even if they couldn't do that, they could implement a number of policies that took the nation in a direction away from slavery. So, like with the trade agreements that they entered into and the industries that they subsidize and all of that, they could sort of steer the nation away from slavery. Now, before the Louisiana Territory, there was a balance of power in Congress. So neither North nor South had enough power to override each other. But with the introduction of the new Louisiana Territory, that's what the people feared, both North and South. If the new slave territories were non-slave states, then that would give the North more power. But if the new Louisiana territories allowed slavery, then all those new states would likely align with the southern states, and they then would have the power to direct the nation. They then could potentially create a law that says you can never outlaw slavery anywhere, right? They could also do things like, the same thing, trade agreements and direct, subsidies to encourage this industry of plantations and slavery. So it was about power. And this is what they were struggling over between the North and the South. And this, by the way, this is another fascinating area for further study. I mean, it was amazing, to see what went on among the states in the lead up to the Civil War, and particularly whenever the United States would acquire new territory, this was a huge issue. And there was all sorts of stuff that went on, statutes that were enacted, and just the debates back and forth about ways to try to solve this. Some were just ridiculous and crazy, and there were riots and all sorts of stuff. It's an amazing area for further study. So what ended up happening? What ended up happening to the new Louisiana states? Were they slavery states or were they non-slavery states? Well, what ended up happening is they ended up compromising, at least for a time period. And this is what led to what became known as the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This shows what the Missouri Compromise was all about. In black, we see outlined the Louisiana Purchase Territory. And over here, we have the states that existed at the time. So to the north in green, we have the free states that did not allow slavery. And to the south in orange, we have the slave states that did permit slavery. So there was a balance of power here between the north and the south. And the whole question was, okay, so if we're going to admit all this new territory, the Louisiana Territory, into the United States, should we allow slavery in this territory? So this is what the Missouri Compromise was about. So what they did was they drew a boundary line. This is the line in red right here, and it's along the 3630 parallel, the latitude line. And they said below the line, slavery will be permitted, and above the line, slavery will not be permitted. Okay, now there was a wrinkle, and the wrinkle is that the northern states wanted to admit the new state of Maine as a new state. Now, previously there were 11 free states and 11 slave states, so the U.S. Senate had 11-11. There was a perfect balance. But when the northern states wanted to admit Maine, this would add a new free state. So the southern states said, wait a minute, that's going to give you an extra state and more power, so we want a new state too that has slaves. So they said, okay, how about a compromise in that even though Missouri is above the line, there's not supposed to be slavery, we will allow slavery in Missouri. So that was the Missouri Compromise. So they drew this boundary line. They said, we'll allow slavery below the line, we will not allow slavery above the line, except in Missouri, even though Missouri's above the line, we will allow slavery in Missouri. So that was the Missouri Compromise, and that is how they resolved the question as to whether slavery should be permitted in this new Louisiana Territory, and that eventually led this new territory to be incorporated into the United States. Now, by the way, it took them 17 years to figure this out. Okay, the Louisiana Purchase was in 1803, but this Missouri Compromise wasn't until 1820. So this shows just what a complicated and divisive issue this was. You might be thinking to yourself, it seems kind of crazy to just draw a line and say slavery on one side and freedom on the other. And, you're right. There were a number of people who shared that sentiment. In fact, Abraham Lincoln addressed this point. So Abraham Lincoln went on to become president during the Civil War. and he actually prosecuted the Civil War, and he believed in having that war, and he was successful in that he won the war. He was able to preserve the Union together, so he prevented the United States from breaking apart into two separate countries, and he ended slavery. So that was pretty good. But he was assassinated for it, which was tragic. So, but Lincoln addressed this point. So this was a few years before he became president. And what he said was, a house divided against itself cannot stand. And this nation would not endure permanently half slave and half free. It had to be either all one or all the other. So what he was saying is he too felt like just drawing a line and having slavery on one side and freedom on the other was a little crazy. So, but you can get a sense of what these members of Congress were trying to do. They were trying to prevent war and hold the Union together. That's what this Missouri Compromise was all about. So at the time, the southern states were saying, we will go to war over slavery. If you try to take slavery away from our states, we will go to war over this. They felt they had no choice because their whole economic system depended upon this institution of slavery. So if you outlaw slavery, all of a sudden they felt like their whole societies were going to collapse. So they were willing to go to war over this. So what the members of Congress here were trying to do is they're trying to strike a balance and make a compromise to prevent war and keep the country together. So you can say, well, did it work? Was it successful? And in some respects it was. I mean, certainly in 1820 it did prevent war. Now, and it was hailed as such as well. Everyone, thought it was a great solution because it did prevent war. But 41 years later, in 1861, the Civil War began. So it didn't prevent war forever. So I think what you have to say is, well, at least it delayed the war. And I think that's true. On the one hand, that's a good thing because it delayed the war. War is a horrible thing. So if you delay it, that's a good thing. On the other hand, you can say, well, it did delay the war, but that means that it allowed slavery to persist all during this 41 years. And that maybe, it's hard to conjecture here, but maybe in some respects it would have been better to have the war in 1820, get the war over with, and then you'd save a lot of people, a lot of misery who were in slavery during this 41 years. So you can see it is just a very difficult issue and a very difficult situation. So but the Missouri Compromise ended up having an interesting subsequent history as well. So it ended up getting challenged in court, and this was years later, but it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck it down and said the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. And in a twist of history, they did so in a case that just so happened to be one of the worst cases in Supreme Court history. The name of the case was Dred Scott versus Sanford, and to this day it is a stain on the Supreme Court. So another thing that was interesting is the Missouri Compromise ended up getting whittled away in subsequent legislation because this issue continued. People were grappling over slavery and where and all that. And so the Congress ended up enacting a statute that started to whittle away and allow potentially slavery in the northern states above the Missouri Compromise line. So it's the whole history of this is fascinating. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820 ends up resolving the issue, at least temporarily, resolving the issue of slavery in this Louisiana territory, and that paves the way for the Louisiana territory to be incorporated into the United States. So once the United States acquired the Louisiana territory, all of a sudden Florida is looking pretty isolated down there. Now, Florida was still owned by Spain at the time, but Spain's main territory was in the southwest of the United States, and with the Louisiana Purchase territory, it divided Spain's territory. So Spain no longer had access to, from its territory in the southwest to Florida, so Florida is looking pretty isolated down there by itself. Now, Florida has a long association with the Spanish. In fact, Florida has a fascinating history. So the Spanish end up landing in Florida very early on, and this was a guy, Ponce de Leon. So after Ponce de Leon explored Puerto Rico, he sailed north and then he landed on the eastern shores of Florida. And this was very early on. This was in 1513. Okay, so that is 500 years ago. Now, if you think about, the United States has only been around for some 200 plus years. This was 500 years ago. So Ponce de Leon lands on the Florida shores here on the eastern portion of Florida. And this is actually the first time that a European recorded sets foot in the United States ever. Okay, now it probably wasn't the first time in reality, but first time in recorded history. So now the Spaniards had been in the Bahamas for a while, in Cuba and Haiti and Puerto Rico, and they had gone into Central America and Mexico, but they had not been in the United States until this time. So it was Ponce de Leon sailing north and landing on the eastern shores of Florida. That's when a European first set foot in the United States. So so this was the first time, of course, that they set foot in Florida. So he founded Florida. Ponce de Leon founded Florida, and he named it Florida because this was in the springtime, and there were a bunch of flowers that were in bloom, and Florida is Spanish for flowery, so he named it Florida. So when you think of Florida, the name Florida was named by the Spanish, and it is a legacy of the Spanish history in Florida. So a few years later, the Spanish founded a city in this area, which was St. Augustine or St. Augustine. And this was also very early on. This was in 1565. So this city was actually the oldest, it is now the oldest permanent European settlement in the entire United States. So this city has a rich history. And in fact, it has the first recorded birth of a European in the United States. So it's not England, it's not at Jamestown, but the first European recorded born in the United States was Spanish. And it was here at St. Augustine. I mean, it's pretty amazing. So the city has turned into a tourist destination because of this rich history, and there's a bunch of buildings and Spanish architecture that you can see, and in fact it served as the center of Spain's ownership of Florida for hundreds of years. It was the Spanish headquarters of Florida for hundreds of years, and in fact there's even an old fort there that you can go visit now, and in fact it is the oldest masonry fort in the entire United States. It dates from like 1672, something like that. So you can actually go and visit that fort. It's pretty amazing. So Spain has had a long history with being in Florida, and so they owned it for hundreds of years. It was their headquarters for hundreds of years in Florida, the city, and then Florida ended up changing hands a couple times later on. So at the end of the 7 Years' War, which was 1763, Spain was forced to give Florida over to Britain. So Britain took it over, and Britain occupied it for 20 years. And then at the end of the American Revolutionary War, when America achieved its independence, America gave Florida back to Spain. So Spain now, here we are at 1803, at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, Spain now owns Florida. So when America acquired the Louisiana Territory, this gave rise to border disputes between Spanish Florida Territory and the Louisiana Purchase Territory. Now, Florida has this, the peninsula on sort of the eastern part of Florida has the peninsula that goes way down, but then as Florida goes up, then it turns west, and there's a panhandle, the western panhandle of Florida. So it's this western area of Florida in the panhandle where the disputes were taking place between Spanish Florida and America territory under the Louisiana Purchase. So there's a bunch of controversies and conflicts about where the boundaries are, and what ends up happening is some U.S. settlers end up going down from the United States and going into this western Florida area and started settling there. There was also some British people there who'd been left over from British rule for the 20 years that Britain had it, and they start resisting Spanish rule. So they end up having a rebellion. This is in 1810, so it's 7 years after the Louisiana Purchase. They rebel, they take over some Spanish garrisons, and they form their own republic. So basically their own country. They secede from Spain and form their own country. In response to this, the United States sent in the military very quickly, annexed this territory, and took it over into the United States. Now, this was over the objections of both Spain and the objections of the people who had just formed their own territory. They didn't want to be part of the United States. They wanted to be their own country. But America quickly took it over. Now, it has been said that this was the first instance of America as a new nation acting as an imperial power, because they went in with arms and they took over a territory that didn't belong to them, and they made it part of their own territory. So that was, and then the U.S. annexed some more territory in western Florida after the first one. So that was what was going on in western Florida, the Panhandle. Then over in eastern Florida, there was trouble brewing there as well, and it resulted from the fact that Spain couldn't really control that territory, because Spain didn't have a lot of people there. They didn't have a great population. They also didn't have a lot of military there. So they weren't able to control the area, and it became sort of a lawless area. So you had these Seminole Indians who were conducting attacks and raids. You had a contingent of escaped slaves from the U.S. who went down into Florida, and some of them actually hooked up with the Seminoles. And so the Seminoles were conducting these attacks and raids, and they ended up starting to do raids over the border. So they came into the United States territory and were raiding United States villages and farms and that sort of thing. So the United States responded to this by sending down the military to stop these raids. And the military was commanded by Andrew Jackson. This is the Andrew Jackson who would later become president. But for now, he's an officer in the Army, and he's sent down to the Florida border to stop these raids and attacks. So Andrew Jackson ends up sending forces into Spanish Florida, because that's where the Seminoles were located. He couldn't just wait at the border. He had to go get them and to stop these attacks. So in doing so, he ends up taking over some territory and some towns, and he ends up taking over some Spanish forts as well. And his rationale was that these Spanish forts were being used as bases for the Seminoles to conduct their attacks in the United States, so he had to take over the forts. So Spain could see that Spain is kind of losing control over eastern Florida, and that the United States was kind of gaining more control over Florida. So what ended up happening a few years later, this is in 1819, is the United States and Spain sat down and entered into a treaty that addressed these issues. Here we see a depiction of what was contained in this treaty of 1819, which was known as the Adams-Onis Treaty. So the main feature was that Florida was ceded by Spain and given to the United States. Now, the United States had been trying to buy Florida from Spain for a number of years while these border disputes were going on, but Spain would not sell. They did not want to sell Florida. But nonetheless, a few years later, here we are, and the United States acquires Florida from Spain. So what did the United States give up in exchange? Well, one thing was, when the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory, there was some question as to the boundary. In fact, the boundary of the Louisiana Territory was not well defined, if you can believe that. That's why all these disputes were happening. So one question was the boundary in the area of Texas, and the United States was claiming the boundary was down here, Spain was claiming it was up here. So in this treaty, it was resolved that the boundary would be along this red line, and thus this area would be owned by Spain. The other thing was that the United States expressly agreed that Spain owns all of this territory. Now, this was not a big give from the United States, because, in fact, Spain did own all that territory, and they had owned it for hundreds of years. But still, there was some significance in having in writing the United States saying, we acknowledge that we do not own this territory. This territory is owned by Spain. Another aspect of this treaty had to do with the Oregon country. So previously, the Oregon Country was being claimed by 3 countries. So Britain was claiming it. Britain up here owned Canada. So Britain was claiming the Oregon Country here. The United States was claiming it owned the Oregon Country, and Spain was claiming it owned the Oregon Country. So in this treaty, Spain relinquished its claims on Oregon Country and agreed that its boundary would be right here at the 42nd parallel. So this is significant because the United States has a claim on the Oregon Country, and now the United States only has to deal with Britain and does not have to deal with Spain over this territory here. But the main takeaway from this treaty was that the United States acquired Florida. With this treaty of 1819 hammered out, it seems like now this may be the permanent situation of things, right? Because you've got the United States here on this side, you've got Spain over here, and they have agreed to their boundaries. So it seems like this is now going to be the permanent situation, and this is the way it's going to be carrying into the future forever. But it was not to be. So what was going on is that Spain had its own problems, and those related to a movement in Mexico towards the independence of Mexico. So just like the United States achieved its independence from Britain with the American Revolution, the same thing was going on in Mexico. The colonists in Mexico said, wow, I really like what the United States did, how they achieved their independence from Britain. We want to do the same thing. So they began the War of Independence in Mexico. So this started in 1810 and went on for a decade plus. And finally, in 1821, the colonists in Mexico prevailed. They won their independence from Spain. Mexico became an independent country and kicked out Spain. So this changes the dynamic, right? So before it was the United States and Spain. Now, with Mexican independence, it's now Mexico. So it's the United States and Mexico. Okay, so this changed the dynamic a little bit. So one thing that Mexico did, this new country of Mexico, is they took a look at the territory that was on their United States border, and they said, you know what, this territory is not well populated. We need to attract more people to this territory so we can build it out, secure it, and really consolidate our ownership of it. So what they said was, you know what, let's try to attract settlers from the United States. Let's try to encourage people from the United States to come down into Mexico and live in Mexico, settle this territory in Mexico. So they implemented a number of new policies, one of which was they changed the immigration laws, and they made it easier for United States people to immigrate down into Mexico. And another thing they did is they offered land grants. So if you came down from the United States into Mexico, you could be given land. Okay, so this actually worked. Right? A lot of people came down from the United States and sought to start settling in Mexico. And one of the big ones and the main guys was this guy by the name of Stephen Austin. And this is now Austin, Texas was named after him. And Austin, Texas is now the capital of Texas. So this territory was Mexico then, but it later became Texas in the United States. It's now Texas. But back then, Texas didn't exist. It was just Mexico. So Stephen Austin comes down from the United States and starts settling this territory. And it wasn't only him. His idea was to bring a whole bunch of people down and build out a much larger territory. So over time, he ended up bringing down hundreds of families to settle this area. So the policy from the Mexican government was working pretty well. And after a while, the Mexican government said, you know what? Maybe this policy is working a little too well, because now there's a lot of these United States immigrants here who've settled this territory. In fact, there's more United States immigrants in the area than there are, Mexican citizens. So the government said this is a problem. Now, it's kind of funny because back then, the problem was United States people immigrating into Mexico and causing Mexico problems, whereas today, the problem is there's too many immigrants from Mexico immigrating from Mexico into the United States and causing the United States problems. So it's funny how the tables have turned. So the Mexican government says, all right, so this is a problem. We've got too many United States citizens coming in and immigrating into Mexico here. So they said, you know what? We need to change our policies here on this. And at the time, there was the president of Mexico was the guy by the name of Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. Now, Santa Anna was a towering figure in the history of Mexico. He is a tremendously colorful figure, and he has this incredible 40-year career in politics and in the army of Mexico. But it was a career that was marked by highs and lows. I mean, 1 minute he's a hero, the next minute he's reviled. 1 minute he's the people love him and elect him president, and the next minute the people despise him and they depose him, and he goes into exile, and then he's brought back from exile and he's a hero again. It's this crazy, amazing career. He was some have referred to him as the Napoleon of Mexico, although certainly without the military genius that Napoleon had. So he's this incredibly, colorful character. So one of the things that he starts to do, Santa Anna, when he's president of Mexico, is he starts to centralize power in the Mexican government. Now, some say that this was a good thing because it was, it represented the modernization of the Mexican government into a federalist system. But others say, no. What this guy was doing is he was a dictator. He was creating a dictatorship for himself and concentrating power in his own hands. So this dynamic was at play when the Texas settlers were trying to figure out what to do here. So what Santa Anna was doing was, by centralizing power, he was taking power away from the local regions, and one of the local regions was these Texas settlers. So, he was taking power away from them. They couldn't decide their own affairs as much anymore, and he was requiring that, all these local areas, the militias lay down their arms, which is a problem for these, Texas folks. So the Mexican government was also changing the immigration policies. So they wanted to stop the flow of these immigrants from the U.S. into Mexico. So they changed the immigration policies to make it more difficult for U.S. citizens to immigrate into Mexico. They also started taxing these settlers. I mean, they implemented taxes that had a concentrated effect on the settlers. So they taxed these lands that the settlers had gotten in land grants that they weren't supposed to be taxed at this rate. They increased the taxes on their lands. They also increased the taxes on their goods. So they were trading goods with the United States because that's where they came from. So they started imposing tariffs on these goods so that the settlers had to suffer increased taxes on that as well. It's all about money. So the settlers were not happy with this at all. So they started to organize, and they started to resist Mexican rule. Now, the perspective of the settlers was, they were saying, look, we're not trying to make trouble here. All we want is, we came into to Mexico under certain rules, and we just want those rules to be restored. I mean, they felt betrayed. They felt like they came into the country under one set of rules. Then, as soon as they got there and settled, Mexico changed the rules on them. It was like a bait and switch, right? So what they were saying is, look, we don't want any trouble. We just want you to restore the rules that existed when we came into the country, because that's why we came here. Santa Anna, on the other hand, did not feel that. He also felt betrayed, actually. So he felt like, look, our mother country of Mexico opened its arms to you, U.S. citizens. We welcome you into this country, and now that you're here in this country, you're refusing to follow Mexican laws. Now, he said, look, we're a country, Mexico's a country, they're gonna change laws, they're gonna enact new laws, and since you are in Mexico, you have to follow those new laws. So Santa Anna, felt betrayed by these Texas settlers. So the Texas settlers start to resist Mexican rule. They take up arms, and these are not, it's not a military, right? These are settlers, right? They're not, trained military. They don't have an army. They're not a separate country. They were just settlers that came in from the United States to settle this territory. Now, the one thing they did have is they had Texas Rangers. Actually, this was the founding of the Texas Rangers. The way the Texas Rangers was founded was this guy, Stephen Austin, who came in, the settler who came in and brought in all these, hundreds of families. He figured out, we kind of need a police force here among these new settlers to protect these new settlers. And so he started the Texas Rangers. And the Texas Rangers, they're this famed, police organization, and they still exist to this day. So these Texas settlers were not a military. They were not an army. They were settlers, but they took up arms and they ended up engaging in some skirmishes with local Mexican officials, and these Texas settlers won. So this emboldened them. When they would engage in these skirmishes, they would keep winning. This emboldened them to think, hey, we can, we've got some power here. So this did not please Santa Anna in Mexico. So Santa Anna sent a little military contingent to, put down this rebellion. And what happened? The Texas settlers actually defeated this little military contingent that Santa Anna sent. So Santa Anna is not happy about this. So he decides, you know what? I've got to go in and crush this rebellion once and for all. And what Santa Anna decides to do is he himself personally decides to lead this military campaign. So he's the president of Mexico, but he decides, I'm going to take a leave here, and I'm going to be the head of this military campaign and go and crush this rebellion. Now, what Santa Anna, this is, how colorful this guy was. This is, typical of this guy. So what he must have been thinking is that this could be an easy military victory, right? He could crush these Texas settlers very easily. He would have another glorious victory on the battlefield that he could then, exploit in his political career. So he personally decides to lead this expedition, into the Texas area and confront these settlers. Now, at the time, what happened with the settlers was they were, engaging in skirmishes and taking over local buildings. And there was one building, it was a mission actually, and it was called the Alamo. And this mission had been occupied by some Mexican officials, and these Texas settlers came in and overtook that mission and took it over for themselves and occupied it with a bunch of soldiers. So they're in this mission, the Alamo. So Santa Anna, when he takes his army and leads his army into this Texas region, he goes to the Alamo, and his plan was to rout these people, kick them out of the Alamo. Unfortunately for Santa Anna and the Mexican army, it is not a rout. It is a very difficult battle because these Texas settlers are putting up a huge resistance from inside of the Alamo. They would not fall. So the siege of the Alamo goes on for days and days and days. It ends up being like 13 days. And it's a very bloody battle. Finally, the Alamo falls and the Mexican army prevails. But even though it's a success for the Mexican army, it is actually more of a success for the Texas settlers because they use this as a rallying cry. The Battle of the Alamo becomes this, this cause for them and a rallying cry for them because they were so successful in resisting for so long and they put up such a fierce fight. And so a number of people died in the Alamo, like all 200 of the settlers died, including some famous people like Davy Crockett. But they inflicted way more casualties on the Mexican army. In fact, the Mexican army had 500 deaths. So the settlers had like 200 deaths at the Alamo, and the Mexican army had 500 deaths at the Alamo. So this is part of the reason why the settlers viewed this as a success and why it became a rallying cry. So after the fall of the Alamo, Santa Anna says, I'm going to lead my Mexican army and I am going to pursue the rest of their army, this Texas settlement. I'm going to wipe them out once and for all. So by this time, the head of this Texas sort of settlement is a guy by the name of Sam Houston. And so he becomes the military leader of this Texas rebelling. And that's Sam Houston. The same Houston as today is Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas was named after this guy, Sam Houston. So he takes command of this, this ragtag group of settlers who are rebelling here, and he realizes that there is no way that we settlers here can face this Mexican army and Santa Anna who are charging us basically. So he says, if I were to do battle with them right now, we'd be wiped out. So what does he do? He decides basically to flee. So he takes his ragtag group of settler army here and he goes on the run. This reflects the current day situation. So here is the current day Texas. Mexico's down here, and this is the borderline between Mexico and Texas. But back then, this was all owned by Mexico. All this territory was owned by Mexico. So this then was the border with the United States. So Mexico was on this side, and the United States was over here on this side. So here's San Antonio. This was the location of the Alamo. So when the Alamo fell, Santa Anna took his Mexican army and continued to pursue the Texas rebels led by Sam Houston. So what does Sam Houston do? He skedaddles. He turns around and runs. So he runs this way. He and the rebels run this way. They're headed east. And the thinking is that they're making a run for the border. And they're going to try to cross this border into United States territory. And the reason is because, most of these Texas rebels are former U.S. citizens, so they feel like they have a friendly party here in the United States. So if they can cross over into United States territory, they feel they'll be safe there, because it's unlikely that the Mexican army is going to actually cross the United States border and encroach into United States territory. So this turns into a chase. Sam Houston and the rebels running for the border, and Santa Anna and the Mexican army chasing them, trying to catch them before they can get to the border. There's actually one instance that is pretty close. So the Texas rebels decide to make camp. They kind of take a break, and the Santa Anna and the Mexican army are continuing to march, and they come very close to the rebel camp, but they never realized where that camp was located. So they were so close to the rebel camp. Had they realized and attacked them there, it would have been all over. But the rebels were able to escape narrowly from that situation. So the chase continues. The rebels are running east, being chased by the Mexican army, until the rebels get to this location of Houston. Now, it was not named Houston then, and the reason is because what was about to happen here is what resulted in this being named Houston. When they get to this area that is today Houston, Santa Anna makes a mistake. He makes a tactical mistake. So what he does is he decides to divide his Mexican army. And the reason he does this is because he knows there's a group of politicians that were involved in the independent movement for Texas, and these politicians were not with Sam Houston with the rebels. They were not part of the rebels. They were located in a different place, in like the seat of government. So what he decides to do is he wants a decisive victory. So he says, you know what, I'm going to take part of my army and I'm going to send them off to where these politicians are, to go and take over where these politicians are, and then at the same time I'll continue to pursue Sam Houston, and then I'll catch these rebels and I'll vanquish the rebel armies, and that way it will be a decisive victory in one blow, because at the same time I'll conquer the politicians and I'll conquer Sam Houston's rebel army. So he divides his Mexican army and sends one portion off to chase these politicians. Now, when Sam Houston learns that Santa Anna had just divided the Mexican army, he says to himself, wait a minute, this is an opportunity here. Because previously he was like, look, I can't fight the Mexican army. There's too many of them. That's why he was running for the border. But when he learns that the force had now been divided, that means the force chasing him is smaller. And he says, you know what? Now maybe I have a chance. So at this location that today is Houston, he stops running for the border, and he turns around and he attacks the Mexican army. Now, he attacks the Mexican army at a time when the Mexican army was not expecting an attack. They were not ready for it. And as a result, these Texas rebels totally rout the Mexican army. It is a tremendous defeat. So the whole battle takes like 20 minutes, and the casualties on the Mexican side were huge and hardly any on the rebel side. So the Mexican side, lost like 600 deaths and like 700 captured. And on the rebel side, it was like 9 deaths. That's it. So it was a total rout. And all the while this was happening, the Texas rebels are yelling, "Remember the Alamo!" So the Alamo was this great battle cry when they ended up, routing the Mexican army. So Santa Anna, the head of the Mexican army, he runs and hides. So he was found hiding in a swamp in the uniform of a soldier. So not in his own uniform as the commander, but in the uniform of a soldier. So he's trying to hide himself and conceal himself, but it doesn't work. So they capture him and they take him back to Sam Houston. Now at this point, Sam Houston had been shot in the ankle with a pretty serious wound. So they take Santa Anna and they bring him to Sam Houston. So what Sam Houston says is, look, Santa Anna, I will let you escape with your life. I'll let you go. I'll let you live, but only if you free Texas right now. So you agree that Texas is its own independent country. And we're going to draw up a document. And you're going to sign it right now saying Texas is its independent country. And then we'll let you live. Otherwise, things aren't looking so good for you. So what does Santa Anna do? He agrees. So he signs this document, and Texas was created as an independent country. This was in 1836. So Texas became its own nation. It wasn't part of the United States. It wasn't part of Mexico. It was its own country. And this went on for like almost a decade of Texas being its own independent country, the Republic of Texas. You know, it became known as the Lone Star Republic, and then later the Lone Star State. You know, in fact, this is one of the reasons why, you know, Texas has such a staunch independent streak to this day. You know, because they feel like they are this, you know, independent nation. So Mexico, however, does not like any of this. In fact, when Mexico got word of what happened with this battle, that Santa Anna had totally screwed this thing up, and you know his army ended up getting routed. The Mexican army gets routed by this band of rebels. What did Mexico do? Mexico deposed him. They deposed Santa Anna. They deposed him in absentia. So while Santa Anna was captive of Sam Houston, Mexico said, we depose you. You're no longer our leader. So as a result, what Mexico said is, that guy who signed the treaty, that wasn't a valid treaty because he wasn't our leader. He didn't have the authority to do it. So Mexico never recognized Texas as an independent country. Mexico said, no, this is nonsense. This Texas territory, you are still part of Mexico. And in fact, this went on for, you know, years. There were skirmishes on the border of, you know, Texas saying we're an independent country, Mexico saying, no, you're not. Yes, we are. No, you're not. Yes, we are. No, you're not. So Mexico, in fact, you know, a number of times made military incursions into Texas. And at one point, they even went in and occupied the city of San Antonio. So this kind of, you know, skirmishing is taking place. But at this point, Texas had declared itself an independent nation.